I'm going to do a review of your portfolio, taking in consideration some of the concerns that you had sent me in the email about wanting to make your work more mature, to start to enter shows on a national level, and how to sort of refocus your energy when you're in the studio. So the way I'm going to do the critique, I'm going to start out with an overview, some general thoughts about the entire body of work all together, and then I'll go through and I'll critique each piece individually, and then at the end of the video I'll just give you sort of a summary and some suggestions as far as moving forward with your work. So the first thing that I would notice about all of your work in general is that I think that you have a really beautiful aesthetic to all of your pieces. I think overall, a lot of the pieces are extremely rich. They have a kind of lusciousness to them that I think has a tremendous amount of depth. And I think visually they're quite captivating. They're pieces that I really think I'd want to spend some time with. They seem like they really kind of invite further, kind of deeper investigation. And I think that's a difficult thing to do. I think nowadays people have such short attention spans and they don't really want to spend a lot of time with things. And your pieces, I think, do, really invite that kind of curiosity because they are so kind of heavily layered and put together. And the other thing I would say, it's funny to me actually that you said in the email that you were worried about, your color choices and about your compositional skills. I'm going to say actually that I think color is one of your greatest strengths. I think your color is really terrific. There's a couple pieces that I think are a little bit weaker than others, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But I think what I really see in your color choices is that you really know how to balance colors well. I think you have a great eye for how to put a sort of deep, dark, muddy color next to a very intense, highly saturated color. And what I see about your color choices is that you're thinking about the pieces as a whole. What I see a lot in a lot of artworks is that people sort of look at colors in isolation. They kind of judge one color at a time. And I don't see that in your work at all. I really see that you have this wonderful kind of big picture view of your work. And I really feel looking at the pieces that the colors really work together. So you have a wonderful understanding of color. The other thing I notice about your work that I think is terrific is that you really know how to work with mixed media very, very well. Mixed media, I think, is one of the most difficult things to do with artwork because I feel like a lot of the time the mixed media pieces that I see, people just kind of throw things together, and oftentimes what happens is the separate media, they don't seem to have a lot of relationship to each other. They seem like they're just kind of thrown together, sort of stuck together, and they don't really blend or transition very well. And what I really like about your mixed media pieces is that those transitions between the pieces are so beautifully done. You really are able to mix and blend the media enough that you're getting kind of the variety of surfaces and textures that is so great about mixed media, but at the same time, they really seem to blend together seamlessly. And that's what I really admire about your work, is that you are able to balance that so successfully. It's really hard for a lot of people to do that. And I think your compositional skills are quite good. There's a couple pieces that I'll get into where I think the composition is not as successful as some of the others, but I think generally speaking, looking at your work, that doesn't seem to me to be the biggest concern at this point. So I think you're in very good shape in both of those areas. I would say in general some improvements. The first thing that I noticed about a couple of your photographs is that if you do want to take your work onto the national level, you're going to need better photographs. Most of them are okay, but you have a couple pieces where I'm noticing, like I think in file number 1, there's quite a bit of glare in the upper half of the piece, which makes it a little bit hard to see the work clearly. There's another piece, I think it's number 8, that is obviously an out of focus photograph. It seems like a really picky thing, but if you want to take your work to the next level and you want to start showing on a more public basis, you really have to make sure you have outstanding photographs, because I think 99% of the time people are going to first encounter your work through a digital image and a screen well before they're going to see it in person. I had a colleague who used to say artists live and die by their photographs, and I think that's absolutely true. You know, a bad photograph can really kind of, you know, represent you poorly. So I don't know if you're taking the photographs. I do have a blog post about how to photograph artwork that I can send you, or if you have someone else who's doing it for you. But I would definitely make sure you invest the time in it. It's really, really worth it. Okay, the second thing that I notice about your work is that it seems like in terms of the imagery that you're portraying, you seem to be kind of wavering between abstraction and representation. For example, the first couple pieces, like I think the first 5 or 7 pieces, you know, are pretty abstract. You know, they have shapes like squares and circles and things like that. But those images don't really kind of reference anything recognizable. They're really kind of purely abstract pieces. But then, you know, if I scroll down a little bit, you know, some of these pieces towards the end, like I think number 12, number 14, number 15, those pieces are quite different because they do have imagery that is recognizable. Like number 12 right here, those are obviously trees, and I think number 11 as well. And those, I think, are sort of difficult because they are kind of so literal. And I think what happens when you're so straightforward about it is your viewer kind of looks at the work and says, oh, it's a tree. And then that's kind of it. And it's not to say you should never make an image of a tree, because obviously people have made thousands of images of trees that have been hugely fascinating, but that you need to offer something in the image beyond just, oh, it's a tree. That, you know, maybe that tree has some other symbolic meaning to it, or maybe there's some other aspect of it that's more engaging on some level. But what I'm seeing in the work is that you're kind of waffling between the two. And to be honest, the piece that I think is probably one of your most captivating pieces, number 14, which I'll get to more specifically later on, that piece to me is really kind of the ultimate combination of abstraction and representation, which I think is so difficult to achieve. Because number 14, it has sort of elements of recognition. Like I sort of feel in that image that there is this tree, there are these roots, and yet they're not so literal like number 12 is. Number 12, I just go, oh, it's a tree. Number 14, I said, well, it kind of looks like a tree, and I sort of see these roots kind of digging down. But the thing is, there's so much kind of imaginative play that you're doing with the material down there that I say, you know, it's not quite a real tree. There's something else happening here. And so that's what I'm interested in your work, is this number 14 piece, because to me it has such a beautiful balance of abstraction and representation. And, you know, I don't know what direction you want to go in, if you have a preference between one or the other. And, you know, I'm not saying you need to make a decision right now, but I think I'd just be very aware of that, because for me, I find number 14 to be extremely captivating. And I feel like when I scroll up to number 1 and 2, I sort of look at those pieces, I say, wow, they're so beautiful and aesthetically pleasing, as you'd mentioned in your email, but that's kind of where it ends. And I don't really kind of get beyond that. And so I'm sort of thinking number 14 might be kind of opening a door for another way for you to go. Now, the other thing that I think you should consider, you know, talking about representation abstraction, is getting some references, some visual references that you can look at to work from. Now, you know, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. The reason I'm saying that is because I'm looking at number 12 again with the trees, and I'm looking at that image. It doesn't look to me like you had any reference for that, because your portrayal of the trees in number 12, it just looks really superficial. It's kind of like the lollipop trees that you see, you know, elementary school students making. You know, they didn't really look at a tree. That's kind of their idea of what they think a tree looks like. But, you know, if you really look at a tree, it doesn't look anything like that. There's so many incredible patterns and surfaces that you could never really come up with on your own. And so, you know, going back to number 14, this piece with the roots, you know, I wonder if you could embark upon kind of deeper visual references and research before you even start making the piece. And let's say, go out in your yard and dig up a bunch of plants and, you know, get some actual roots that you can draw from. You can go online, you can go to a natural history museum. I know where I teach at the Rhode Island School of Design, we have something called the Nature Lab, which is kind of this miniature natural history museum, and people can observe all sorts of different specimens. So there's a million different ways you can do visual research, but I would really strongly encourage you to do that because nature is so fascinating. The patterns that you'll find, the surfaces, the textures, and I can tell from your work how much you love texture and surface. And I just think that if you really spent time looking at nature very closely, whether it's through a microscope or through a real object or something, I mean, I think the best thing to do is to get actual plants, you know? Like I did a bunch of prints a few years ago based on ginseng plants, and so these roots, I went and I bought them at the supermarket in Chinatown, so I was really able to look at those carefully. So I would really encourage you to get actual plants and specimens. You know, obviously online gives you more access, but I would really encourage you to do that. I think it will really kind of beef up the specificity of your images tremendously. Now, you didn't really send me an artist statement. I mean, I didn't ask you for one, so I wasn't really expecting it. But I don't know if you have an artist statement, but if you do want to show at the national level, you do need an artist statement that talks about what your work is about. And the sense I'm getting from looking at your portfolio and reading your email about your thoughts and concerns is that it seems to me like your work right now where it stands is that it's really captivating visually and it's really engaging as far as the look of it, but that I don't really see a lot of content going on. Like when I look at the work, the reason I say that is because number one, you are waffling between abstraction and representation. That kind of makes me think that you haven't fully worked out what kind of imagery you want to make, but also, you know, at the national level, you know, the work is not just about what it looks like. It's not just about looking pretty. It really needs to have some kind of message, whether you want to communicate something narrative, whether it's a personal story, whether it's a political message. I mean, whatever it is that you want to talk about. And it doesn't have to be fancy, you know, it could be very simple, but you are going to need to write something that talks about what your interest is beyond what the piece looks like. And, you know, I can give you some references later on for, you know, how to start to think about that, but that is critical. You know, if you want to kind of advance to kind of the next level of being a professional artist, you will need to do that. And right now, I don't see that in the work so much. And it's not because you didn't give me an artist statement, but because I don't really see that kind of focus in terms of content and engagement. The other suggestion I'm going to make is that I really think you should consider a change of format, because what I notice about all of your pieces, pretty much all of them are either squares or rectangles. And I know the square and the rectangle, that's just kind of the default choice of shape for a lot of people when they make two-dimensional work. Most people just kind of float to there because it just sort of seems like that's what it is. But when I look at the images of your portfolio, your images have so much vibrancy and life and movement and layering, and they're mixed media pieces. And so all of those characteristics that I just described seem to be, you know, so kind of constrained by the square and the rectangle that you're putting them in. And so I think what I'd really recommend you do is to just blast your way out of those squares and rectangles and make images where you let that piece of fabric that you collaged on hang off the edge, where you make some sort of unusual shape, a jagged, rocky shape, where you make a shape that's a circle, or you make a shape that's, you know, a bunch of stripes hung together. I think it's kind of crazy that your pieces are squares and rectangles. And it seems to me right now that the squares and rectangles, they look like default sort of choices. They don't look like deliberate decisions. They don't look to me like, oh my God, this has to be a square or a rectangle. It seems like it just worked out that way. And there's such an incredible range of things you can do in terms of format. And I think if you could just break out of that square and rectangle, I mean, given that they're mixed media pieces, I think that's the perfect solution for where to go. I'll send you some artists that I think you can look at who work with, you know, two-dimensional pieces that kind of break out of that square and rectangle, because I think that would really help you so much, because I just could imagine that you could do incredible things with that. So I would consider that. Okay, so now we're going to go through and I'm going to talk about the individual pieces. So this piece I think is got gorgeous color. I think the saturation of this red, again, we have not very good glare, we have bad glare back here, which is making it hard. I'm guessing this is a very dark area like it is in this upper left-hand corner, but I think the way that these really kind of lift and pop off the page is lovely, the way this pushes back, and I think this is just a gorgeous transition in the background, you know, moving from this black into this more kind of almost looks like wallpaper or kind of like Roman ruins or something that I think is really lovely. I sort of wish there was a larger change of scale in the squares, because this is the biggest square, and I kind of think like, what if you had a huge one in the upper left hand corner and then had some that were absolutely tiny, and then that might be a way just to kind of stretch the range of scale, because I think when you work abstractly, scale is hugely important. You know, if all your brush strokes are the same width, if everything's kind of the same size, it gets boring pretty fast. But I love the textures here. I think you've done such a great job moving that around. Okay, so this piece, again, I think beautiful color choices, you know, using the complementary colors of the yellow against the purple. And the other thing I would say too, in addition to your color choices, is you've got a great sense of contrast. What I see a lot in artworks is that people rely on color contrast. They don't think enough about light and dark contrast. And you're so good with these rich, deep, substantial purples. I mean, they have so much kind of weight to them, so much gravity, and what that does is these gold squares that are kind of floating on top, they seem to really kind of float in a way, and I really am so totally convinced by the layering. You know, I think this area is beautifully, masterfully done. I mean, again, that richness of layering that I'd mentioned earlier is just so beautifully done. I'm kind of guessing, because I'm not seeing in person, but it looks like there's sort of an embossment down here. It looks like it's not a totally flat piece. I wish I could see it in person, but you know, I think it seems like your pieces are probably really physical in person, that you probably can see a lot of the impressions of your material, and I'm really excited about that. And you know, the thing that I like about this piece the most actually is this area here and this area here. Things start to kind of explode a little bit, get a little messier. And I kind of wish there was more of that, like here where the squares start to kind of break down and dissolve. You know, I kind of like that as a contrast against this area, which is so crisp and so, you know, kind of well defined. But I almost wonder if you could push this kind of breakdown further, that, you know, maybe this is kind of the controlled, kind of tense, rigid area, and then everything kind of bursts into chaos. So I guess what I'm saying is you already have so many wonderful aspects to this piece. I'm just kind of wondering, like the last one, can we stretch that just a little further? You know, can we make the chaos a little bit bigger? Can we make the rigidity even more? So it's like taking what you already have, but kind of adding extremes to both ends. And maybe that's one way to consider it. Okay, so this piece here I think is not as strong as the last two that I saw. It's a more kind of demure piece in a way. I mean, it's a more subtle piece, and the contrast isn't quite as high. And I'll tell you, these last three pieces together, after looking at them in a row, they do get a little repetitive. And that's what I was going to get into before, is that you want to make sure that the pieces are similar enough that it looks like you have focus and attention, but you don't want them so similar that somebody looks at the third piece and they go, oh, well, I kind of saw that before. And that's kind of how I feel with this third piece, is I kind of go, yeah, I saw that. Yeah, I kind of know. The one kind of nice, refreshing surprise about this piece that I really appreciate, that I do see more in some of the later pieces, is some of this kind of string-like painterly work, and I think that's really fun. I actually wish there was a lot more of it to kind of contrast against the squares, or you could play with the orientation of the squares, you know, maybe tilt this one like this, tilt another one another way. I think the fact that they're all kind of lined up in a way, it creates this rigidity in the structure that I think you should try to break out of a little bit more. I think if anything, you know, your technique is so good, you really, I think, would benefit from kind of letting go a little bit more. You know, I'm not worried about your technique. Your technique is outstanding, and you clearly have such a wonderful command of your material, but to a certain degree, this piece to me is a little bit too controlled. It's like you're trying too much to exert your power over things. And I think what I enjoy about these kind of stringy patterns in the background, is those seem to be areas where you're just kind of letting go a little bit more. You're letting it be messy. You're letting it be more chaotic. And I think if you embrace that, that could be really wonderful. Okay, so this piece again, you know, a little bit repetitive. I mean, what I sort of see in these past 4 pieces, the only real shift that I see is in color. The structure of all the pieces is the same. It's the same kind of, you know, texture in the background with these floating squares rather, and the real change comes in the color. And certainly that is exciting, you know, because I think this one again has just a beautiful distribution of the yellow, especially this intense area in the center, I think is really quite lovely. But I don't think just changing color is enough. I think you need to have changes that are a little bit more dramatic, and so that's why I was kind of thinking, you know, what if you tilt the square? What if you make it much, much bigger? There's a lot of things you can do with that. This one I do like better in terms of scale because you've got these teeny tiny little squares, and those are a really nice contrast against these big ones that are a lot more defined. And I do start to see little bits of this almost marbled kind of texture, and I like that, and I want to see more of it. I kind of feel like in these last few pieces that the squares are almost too dominant in a way, and I wonder if you could let some of those other elements like this and the squiggly lines, you know, these over here that we were talking about before, if you could let those breathe a little bit more, let them kind of penetrate those squares further. Okay, so this piece, you are starting to kind of orient the squares, and the introduction of circles is quite good. I don't know that I really like this square in the middle. I think it's a little bit too kind of rigid and kind of stable. You got to be careful about horizontals and verticals in a composition because they tend to look really static. I mean, I think what's saving you in the composition is that these are kind of oriented in a haphazard way. And so I really feel like this part of the piece is strongly dynamic. It's really activated, it's moving. And I do like the transition that these look really solid and then eventually you move over here and that does that. But this gigantic square in the background, I think it's a little bit problematic. I sort of wish it wasn't there. It's also way in the background. It seems like it shouldn't be so prominent because for me, the main event of this piece is here. This is the action. This is what we came to see. And this is almost like something that isn't the main act trying to steal the show. So I think with this piece, I would push this back, make it almost not discernible. I also think this is awkward cropping. I want these squares to go off the page. I think it's a little strange that they almost go off the page. And so it's this very kind of awkward positioning. And so I'd really just kind of let things kind of leak into the edge as much as you possibly can. Okay, so this piece is a real kind of breath of fresh air after looking at the first 4 pieces. And I think a couple things are happening. I think the orientation of these long pieces is a lot more chaotic. They really look like they're kind of like bumping into each other in a way. And the color is much more diverse. You know, the past 4 pieces that we looked at, it was kind of limited to 2 colors that were kind of working together. This one is much more diverse because what you have going on is you have warm colors against cool colors, and so it shifts back and forth between warm and cool, and so there's just a lot more going on. Again, with these squiggly lines in the background, I want more of them. I feel like the squiggly lines right now, they're almost like they're just tickling the page, and I want it to be a really kind of prominent feature of the piece. I almost feel looking at those squiggly lines that you were hesitant about putting them there, that you were like, I don't know if I really want to put them down. And you know, if you're going to put them down, put them down. Let them be confident. Let them really be a part of this piece, because I see confidence in these shapes. I mean, these shapes are so fun, they're so playful. I like these round shapes that are coming in here. And then in here, it's almost like you're apologizing for the squiggly lines. I say go for it, you know, just kind of get into it. This space here, I'm a little bit on the fence. It's a bit empty. On the other hand, if this was full, I think maybe your composition would be too packed and too busy, and maybe we need this area to breathe. Maybe if there's a little more transparency, because it kind of looks to me like you painted over some of the collage shapes. And I think my favorite area is probably down here, where I can kind of see the remnants of those collage shapes, that I can still see the paint over it. I think here maybe you put down a little too much paint. The paint got a little bit too opaque. And so here I'm kind of losing the depth that you've achieved so beautifully in this area and this area as well. But I think this is a really exciting piece just because it's such a change of pace. Okay. So this piece, I think, has some really great things happening. I think what isn't helping you, though, is this gigantic rectangle. I think if you could eliminate this rectangle or just make it less prominent, the piece would breathe more. Because what I kind of see right now is this gorgeous pattern in the background that I think is beautifully done, really lovely mixtures and color choices. And then this area just kind of looks stuck on. Like, it doesn't really seem like this rectangle is interacting with this background. The one exception is this circle here, which overlaps the two. And this area I love because these kind of bubble shapes, they look like they're behind this rectangle and they're kind of like traveling around and in front. And so this is a beautiful little moment, but I wish there was more of that. I wish that there were 4 or 5 other sections like this where we could see the bubbles kind of walking into this area, moving around them or something. So I think I just work on that transition a little bit more, because not only is this a straight vertical line and these are straight horizontal lines, which doesn't make for a great composition, but the two things look kind of tacked on top of each other. And I think that you just want to merge them a little bit more closely. And I would also work on some contrast. It seems like it's a little bit dull, a little bit dark. You might want a couple really kind of punchy areas of bright light. This is one of the photographs I mentioned earlier that was out of focus. I think especially up here, it seems like a little bit muddy, so just make sure you get a better photograph. This is, I think, one of your weaker pieces, I think, because first of all, it's more graphic. I don't think that you've done as successful of a job of transitioning from one area to the next. For example, this tree looks kind of transparently collaged on top of this landscape. And I think here you're kind of showing us how you made it, which sometimes can be great. It depends on the artwork. But I think in your case, because you're doing mixed media, I don't really want to see that something was glued on. I just want to kind of enjoy the work for what it is. This scribble in the background, for me, comes totally out of nowhere. It doesn't have any kind of visual association with anything else. And then the background, again, is so different than what's happening with this tree thing that the tree looks just kind of tacked on in a way. And so I think the problem I have with this piece is that just the various components, they don't really relate to each other very much. They look like they're just kind of thrown together and they're kind of awkwardly standing. Also, I don't think black and white is your forte. I think you're great at color, and I think you should embrace that whenever you can. This is one of your strongest color pieces. I think this piece is extraordinarily luminous. You know, this glow that you've achieved in the background, this fiery red, these beautiful mosaic tiles over here, this incredible, like, sort of raw, you know, kind of fiery red is gorgeous. And then even these subtle areas here on the side, you know, which aren't as loud as, say, what's happening here, are really beautifully done. So color-wise, fantastic. Image-wise, I don't think it's so great. I think because it's really obviously a moon and branches and trees, and down here you got these tiny little plants. This is where visual research would help you, you know, not to just get a tree, but find a specific kind of tree. Find a specific, you know, tree that has certain leaves, or, you know, I think if you did that research, this piece would really do much better, because aesthetically pleasing wise, it's great. But I just feel like you're giving us this kind of shallow understanding of what a tree looks like. I think trees are much more sophisticated than this. I think that they have shapes that are a lot less expected, and right now you're kind of giving us the most obvious response. Also, watch out for this where the moon is right up against the tree here and here. I love this. I love that the branch just cuts right through the tree. That's such a great use of depth of field. But I think this would be better if this tree just went right over, and then maybe this one just moved the moon over a little bit to the right. Okay, so this, I think, compositionally is one of your weaker pieces. I like the use of the fabric. The transparency is quite lovely. Even this kind of sheen of the glitter is good. But I just feel like this is the same vertical line kind of over and over again, and I don't feel that there's quite as much depth as there is in some of your other pieces. The stars, I don't mind them, but they're too prominent in this piece. I think that they call a lot of attention to themselves, especially in this area here. Here they're blended more, so I don't notice them so much, but I almost think that this piece is maybe unfinished, that maybe it needs 2 or 3 further layers to really kind of go further. I do very much like the purples and the yellows, you know, and some of this over here almost looks like watercolor. Is a really beautiful area. I don't think I like the imagery much, again, because it is that kind of cliche moon with trees in front of it. And that's where, again, I think research will help you. And, you know, moons aren't always circles. Moons can be so many different things. If you look up images of the moon in different phases and what a moon with a lunar eclipse looks like, I mean, there's just endless possibilities there. Okay, this piece I also think is one of your weaker pieces. The color is not as strong. The composition, I think, is sort of mediocre. I think as far as the imagery goes, it is, again, a tree, and that's kind of it. Very literal, very straightforward, kind of end of discussion. So similar things that, you know, get specific about leaf shape. You know, if you think about a ginkgo tree, it has like those fan-like leaves that are so specific. I find that when people make imagery that's kind of vague or non-specific or kind of general, it tends to be not interesting. Like if you could look at your piece and tell me, okay, it's this species of trees, and I really researched that species, that could be really outstanding. Same thing with the terrain, you know, look at rocks, look at different landscapes, do your homework there. Okay, this piece is a little bit better and it's more fun, but again, it's kind of got the same problems that the last one had. This is better. I think some of these circular motions in the leaves, I kind of feel like in this last one, this is a little bit less interesting, but in this one, there seems to be more variety. I'm not thrilled with these trunks. I feel like they're just kind of stuck there, and that was an opportunity, I think, for texture and surface. And this piece, again, I do feel is kind of underworked. I think it needs, again, another layer or two. This piece, I think, probably needs more surface down here at the bottom. I think this looks a little bit too smooth for me. I mean, kind of the action is up here. I'm kind of guessing this is a landscape, but it seems like you need a little bit more work down here. Up here, I'm really excited. I think there's a lot of movement. This I kind of like because it's sort of suggesting a mountain, but it's not so obvious like the last two were with the trees. And so this, I think, is a better compromise because it's suggestive. It's not super literal like it was in the last few. So I think this piece is pretty good. I just think the landscape needs a lot more. I can see this meticulous stitching that you've done all over. I actually want more of that. I think if you could quadruple the quantity of the stitching and make it more prominent, that could be a great way to do it. Okay, this piece, I have to say, I think is one of your strongest pieces that I've seen in your whole portfolio for all the reasons I said before, that it's like got the best of everything. It's like your, I don't know, it's like your greatest hits album or something like that, because the transitions, I think, are gorgeous. I think this kind of root section is just extraordinary. And again, you know, these I kind of like because, first of all, you cropped the trees. You didn't show us the upper section, which is kind of what people tend to look at. You just showed us the lower half of the trunk, and the emphasis is on the roots, which literally you cannot really see. I mean, nobody really does a cross section of the earth in real life. And so you're showing us an area that's not real, that a view that most people would never really see. And so that kind of brings us to a more kind of surrealistic point of view. And then what I love about this landscape is that you have these vertical kind of drippy lines that I just would never think to do as a landscape. You know, a lot of people, they think about landscape, they think grass and rocks and stuff like that. But here you have this landscape that almost looks like, you know, rain coming down the side of a window. I mean, although it is red rain, I suppose. But, you know, that's so unexpected. Like, I don't expect someone to make a landscape like that. I think that's fantastic. And then this, you know, kind of bacteria bubble-like background. I mean, it almost looks like a disease or something. I mean, I don't, that doesn't like a compliment, but it is. I think this is so fascinating. Again, you don't expect this pattern in a sky. You just don't expect to see it. And then the roots, the way that they grow and progress and change. I mean, this is really beautifully layered and just gorgeous sequences. You've got big shapes, you've got teeny tiny shapes, and I just think it's a beautifully composed piece. Everything is so wonderfully balanced with everything else. You've got dark areas, you've got bright areas. Like I said, this is your greatest hits album, and I think you should maybe think about this piece as kind of your guide for where you might want to go. Okay, so this piece, I like the colors of it, but I sort of have problems with these shapes because, again, I sort of feel like they're kind of star slash sunflower shapes that you kind of just made up in your head without any visual resource. And I think what you could do is if you have a shape like this that you're kind of thinking about, try to get more than one subject, because when I look at the shape, I sort of think sunflower, I sort of think firework, explosions. I think about stars and starfish, even, this almost looks like the ocean or something. And so for this one shape, you could have a photo of a sunflower, a photo of a firework, a photo of a sea star, and kind of combine aspects of all four of those totally unrelated images and create something new. I just kind of feel like the kind of depth of your research is not there right now as far as the visuals go. And if you get into some of the specifics, that's going to help you quite a bit. So just to summarize, I think you're at a sort of point where you're ready to make a big shift. And maybe what you're ready to do is to embark upon sort of like a short period of experimentation. Like, just tell yourself, you know what? I'm not going to finish anything for 1 month. For 1 month, I'm not going to put any pressure on myself to complete anything or to feel like I have to do my best work necessarily. Just give yourself 1 month to just play. Just play around, play with format, play with visual research, break out of that square and that rectangle. You obviously are an incredibly hard worker. You're very disciplined. I mean, you can't make work like this and be lazy. That's just not possible. And I'm sure I'm not even appreciating nearly half the depth of detail that's in these pieces because I just can't see it. And so I don't think for you it's a matter of more time in the studio. I think it's a shift of direction, a shift of mindset is what's really going to help you, because I think what you've recognized, and this is so great that you're self-aware enough to be able to do this, because I think a lot of people can't. You've recognized that you've kind of hit a plateau, that you've kind of done all you can do with what you've done so far, which is to make these really rich, gorgeous, aesthetically pleasing pieces, and you probably are feeling like you would just be repeating yourself. And so I think what you need is just a really dramatic change. You got to make work that kind of builds upon your previous skill level and experience, but pieces that just kind of totally kind of mess with your world in a way. And I think the most important thing is to break out of that square and rectangle. I think if you do that, you're going to find that the possibilities are endless. And I would be thrilled to see what you end up doing, because I'm imagining all the extraordinary things that you could do. So, I think all in all, you're in a great place. And I think that you're clearly very accomplished. You have really fantastic work. You obviously have, things that you can continue to work on, but I think you should be excited about where you are and the possibilities that you can look forward to, because I think you're going to do great. I can't imagine that, things are not going to work out for you. I think that if you just, give yourself a little time to just play a little bit and take away the emphasis on trying to finish, I think you're going to do really well.